Senator from Georgia.
I am honored and privileged to join Leader McConnell and Senator Chambliss to take a few minutes to talk about one of my great friends, Paul Coverdell, and his lovely wife, Nancy. Mitch McConnell has done some great recollections of Paul's service in the Senate. Senator Chambliss has told some great stories of his relationships with Senator Coverdell. I want to share some of mine to just certify and document that everything they've said is absolutely correct. I met Paul Coverdell in 1972, 2 years after he was elected to the Georgia State Senate, as the 5th Republican to serve there. I was running for the Georgia House of Representatives, and although I lost in '74, I won in 1976. And a few years later, I became the leader of the Republicans in the Georgia House of Representatives, and Paul was the Senate leader. The Senate had their caucus elections every January after elections. I always loved the Senate election. They had 5 caucus officers and 5 Republican senators. So instead of having an election, they drew straws. And they drew straws, and they drew Paul Coverdell, to which he was forever reelected as leader of the Republicans in the Georgia State Senate. Now, Paul was the most organized guy I have ever known and was the most goal-oriented guy I'd ever known. His goal, when we were outnumbered 10-1 in the Senate, Democrat to Republican, and 8-1 Democrat to Republican in the House, he dreamed of the day we were in the majority. And as the Republican leader of the House, he would summon me by kind invitation on every Monday morning to the Buckhead Waffle House or the Buckhead IHOP, where we would have coffee and talk how one day we were going to be the majority party in Georgia. Now, I'm an optimist. I was a salesman all my life. I believe we could get there too, but Paul had a step-by-step plan, a plan that in 1976 seemed tantamount to impossible, but a plan that was realized with his election to the Senate in 1992, a congressional majority for Republicans in Georgia in 1994, and ultimately the first governor in the history of our state post-Reconstruction in 2002. Paul meticulously was a partisan, but he was above that an American. Paul Coverdell was also a man of ideas. Folks have talked about the Coverdell savings accounts, education accounts, which he authored in the Senate and are now law. But I remember in Georgia in the 1970s and 80s when he championed the mandatory seatbelt law. And believe me, in a state like Georgia, where you got a lot of pickup trucks, a lot of rural communities, wearing a seatbelt wasn't the most popular thing in the world, but Paul knew it was good for saving lives. He knew it was good for lowering insurance rates because he was an insurance man. And he fought against a majority that didn't want it, but he prevailed and he won. And today, many lives have been saved because of the efforts of Paul Coverdell in the Georgia legislature. Now, Senator Chambliss told his story of Paul in his dark suit and his red tie and his white shirt. I want to tell mine. Back in 1982, I was on the beach at Jekyll Island, Georgia, following a joint House Republican, Senate Republican conference. And Haskew Brantley, the late Haskew Brantley, then a Georgia state senator, and I were on the beach under an umbrella enjoying the beautiful coast of Georgia and our great island, Jekyll Island. In the distance, we could see this figure coming toward us that looked from a distance to have a suit on, walking on the beach with his shoes in his hand and his pant legs rolled up. And the closer he got, the more Haskew and I realized that's Paul Coverdell. And Paul came in his red tie, his button-down white shirt, his dark pinstripe suit, but with his shoes in his hand. Sat in the sand with us, talked, got up, walked back to the parking lot, and drove to Atlanta. In fact, I'm not sure I ever saw Paul when he didn't have on the dark suit, the red tie, and the white shirt. He was always dressed to the nines, and he was always ready for whatever challenge came. His wife, Nancy, who is a beautiful lady I saw just a few weeks ago on the coast of Georgia, actually had her real estate license in my company. So not only did I know Paul, but I knew Nancy. And for 35 years, they were as close of friends as I've ever had. But for 35 years, they served Georgia day in and day out in whatever capacity they could to make it a better state. I think it's a great tribute to tell this story. When Paul was elected in the Georgia State Senate as the 5th Republican in history in 1970, for somebody to think a Republican majority could ever have taken place, they would have laughed. But shortly after Paul's death, the Legislative Office Building, where every member of the Georgia House and Senate in downtown Atlanta has an office, is now the Paul Coverdell Legislative Office Building. He went from the bottom in terms of numbers and he went to the top, but he climbed it one step at a time. He climbed it one commitment at a time. And he never lost sight of the fact that he was an American first and a Republican second, but always committed to the values of Georgia and the values and the conservative principles that we share. So on this day, just 10 years after his passing, we rise today to pay tribute to a great American, a great member of the Senate, and a leader who made it possible for people like Senator Chambliss and myself to follow in his footsteps and one day ultimately serve in the greatest deliberative body in the world, the United States Senate. I pay tribute to Paul Coverdell and his legacy and his beautiful wife, Nancy, and yield back the balance of my time.
Cloture having been invoked